The blood on Elijah Young's hands might as well have been permanent, no matter how many times he'd scrubbed them in creek water cold enough to crack skin. It was 1878, and the West had claimed more souls than anyone dared count, but only one haunted him day and night. As he rode his dun-colored stallion across the sun-baked plains of Central California, the familiar weight of guilt pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than the midday heat. His weathered face, once handsome beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, had hardened into something unrecognizable over the past 2 years. At 32, the lines etched around his eyes spoke of more than just squinting against the harsh sun. They told stories of sleepless nights and days spent running not from the law, but from himself. The town of Wasco emerged from the horizon like a mirage, a collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the heat. Elijah hadn't planned to stop there, but his horse needed rest, and the wound in his side courtesy of a knife-wielding card player in Bakersfield who'd accused him of cheating needed attention. The bleeding had slowed to a seep, but the pain radiated through his torso with each step of his horse. "Just a day," he muttered to himself, patting his horse's neck. Just long enough to patch up and move on. Moving on was what Elijah did best these days, never staying long enough to form connections, never letting anyone close enough to see the darkness he carried. The main street of Wasco was quiet in the afternoon heat. A few horses stood hitched outside the saloon, tails swishing at flies. A dog slept in the shade of the general store's porch. Elijah's arrival stirred little interest, just another drifter passing through, and in these parts, that was hardly noteworthy. He dismounted carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. Leading his horse to the water trough outside the livery, he let the animal drink while he assessed the town. Small but prosperous enough. The buildings were well maintained, which meant law and order had a foothold here. New in town. The voice came from behind him, causing Elijah to stiffen before he turned. The livery owner stood wiping his hands on a rag, eyeing Elijah with the casual suspicion reserved for strangers. "Just passing through," Elijah replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Need a stall for my horse for the night." The man nodded, looking over the dun. "Fine animal, that'll be 50 cents. Name's Howard, by the way. Elijah Young." The name felt strange on his tongue. He'd been giving false names for so long that the truth felt like a lie. "Well, Mr. Young, I'll take good care of your horse. There's a boarding house 2 doors down from the general store if you need a place to sleep." Elijah handed over the money and retrieved his saddlebags. As he turned to walk away, a wave of dizziness hit him and he staggered, catching himself against the wall of the livery. "You all right there?" Howard stepped forward, concern replacing suspicion. "Fine," Elijah managed, straightening. But the sudden movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his side, and he couldn't suppress a grimace. Howard's eyes narrowed. "You're bleeding." Elijah looked down to see a dark stain spreading on his shirt. "It's nothing. Don't look like nothing to me. We got a doctor in town, but he's out at the Callahan place delivering a baby. Won't be back till morning. I'll manage." Elijah took a step, his vision swimming. "Now hold on." Howard caught his arm. "My wife's sister lives just at the edge of town. She's good with doctoring. Name's Nora. Nora Vance. Lost her husband in '75 to typhoid. She helps folks when the doctor can't." Elijah wanted to refuse, but the world was tilting dangerously. "I don't want to impose." "Better than bleeding out in the street," Howard replied pragmatically. "Come on, I'll take you there." The short walk to the edge of town felt endless. By the time they reached a neat white house with a small vegetable garden out front, Elijah was sweating and pale, leaning heavily on Howard. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her late 20s, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical knot, wisps escaping to frame a face that had known both laughter and sorrow. "Howard, what's this?" Her eyes, the warm brown of fresh-turned earth after rain, took in Elijah's condition with a quick, assessing glance. "Nora, this fella's hurt. Knife wound, looks like. Doc's out at the Callahan place." She stepped back without hesitation. "Bring him in." The interior of the house was cool and smelled of herbs and baking bread. Nora led them to a small bedroom off the main living area. "Put him here," she directed, pulling back a quilt. "Howard, fetch my medicine basket from the kitchen shelf." Elijah sank onto the bed, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Madam, I appreciate this, but save your strength," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Howard, some clean water too, please." As Howard left to fetch the items, Nora turned her attention to Elijah, her hands moving with confident efficiency as she helped him remove his coat. "I'm Nora Vance," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And you are Elijah Young, madam." "Well, Mr. Young, let's see what we're dealing with." She unbuttoned his bloodied shirt with clinical detachment, but Elijah couldn't help noticing the gentleness of her touch. When she pulled the fabric away from the wound, he hissed in pain. "Sorry," she murmured, examining the gash. "It's deep but clean. How did this happen?" "Disagreement over cards," he admitted. Something flickered in her eyes, not judgment but understanding. "Seems an expensive way to settle a dispute." Howard returned with the water and basket, setting them beside the bed. "Need anything else, Nora?" "No, thank you. I can manage from here." After Howard left, promising to check in later, Nora set to work cleaning the wound. Her movements were deft and practiced, though occasionally her proximity made Elijah acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd been this close to a woman. "This will hurt," she warned before pouring a clear liquid over the wound that burned like fire. Elijah clenched his jaw but made no sound. "Most men would have cursed the air blue by now," she remarked, reaching for needle and thread. "Not my first time being patched up," he replied. "I gathered that." She nodded toward the web of scars that decorated his torso. "You've led an interesting life, Mr. Young, not by choice." She met his eyes briefly, something in her expression suggesting she understood more than he'd said. "Few of us get to choose our paths entirely." The stitching was painful but quick, Nora's needle moving with practiced precision. When she finished, she bandaged the wound neatly. "You'll need to stay still for a few days," she said, washing her hands in the basin. "The wound needs time to start healing properly." "I appreciate the help, Mrs. Vance, but I'll be moving on tomorrow." She turned, drying her hands on a clean cloth. "That would be unwise. The wound could reopen, and out there alone, infection would likely kill you." "I've survived worse." "Perhaps. But there's no need to test that theory when there's a perfectly good bed right here." Her tone softened. "I have the space, Mr. Young. My son is away visiting his grandparents for the summer." Elijah wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance he'd so carefully cultivated between himself and others. But exhaustion and pain were taking their toll, and the simple kindness in her offer was harder to resist than he'd expected. "2 days," he conceded. "I'll pay you for your trouble." "We can discuss that later. For now, you should rest." She gathered her supplies. "I'll bring you some broth when you wake." After she left, Elijah stared at the ceiling, listening to her move about the house. The unfamiliar feeling of being cared for unsettled him, almost as much as it comforted him. He hadn't allowed himself such comfort since that day 2 years ago, when everything had changed. As sleep claimed him, his last thought was of Nora Vance's eyes, and how they'd looked at him with kindness rather than the judgment he deserved. Nora stood at her kitchen window, watching the golden light of sunset spill across her small garden. The stranger sleeping in her spare room troubled her thoughts. There was something in his eyes, a haunted look she recognized all too well. She'd seen it in her own reflection after James died, that mixture of grief and guilt that came from surviving when someone you loved didn't. She stirred the pot of beef broth simmering on the stove, adding a pinch of dried thyme from her stores. Healing bodies was straightforward enough, it was healing souls that proved the greater challenge. Not that the cowboy had asked for that kind of help, nor was it her place to offer it. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Evening, Nora." Sheriff Mills stood on her porch, hat in hand. In his 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, he'd been a friend to her and James. "Howard mentioned you had a wounded stranger staying with you. Thought I'd check in." "That's thoughtful, Thomas. Please come in." She stepped back, gesturing to her small sitting area. "How bad is he hurt?" the sheriff asked, settling into a chair, knife wound to the side, deep but clean. "He'll heal if he rests. And the man himself, Howard didn't know much about him. His name is Elijah Young. Beyond that," she shrugged, "he's not especially talkative." Sheriff Mills nodded thoughtfully. "Been any trouble from Bakersfield way recently?" "Thought I'd ask around, make sure we're not harboring anyone who might bring problems." "He mentioned a disagreement over cards," Nora admitted, "but he doesn't strike me as an outlaw, if that's what you're asking." "Your judgment's always been sound," the sheriff said with a small smile. "Still, I'd like to speak with him when he's up to it, of course." Nora hesitated, then added, "There's something wounded about him, Thomas, and I don't mean the knife." Understanding flickered in the sheriff's eyes. "Seen that a lot out here, men carrying burdens heavier than most could bear." He stood, replacing his hat. "Let me know if you need anything." After the sheriff left, Nora filled a bowl with the fragrant broth and carried it to the spare room. She found Elijah awake, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that suggested his mind was far away. "I've brought you something to eat," she said, her voice pulling him back to the present. He shifted, wincing slightly as he sat up against the pillows. "Thank you." She placed the tray across his lap, noticing how his hands, though calloused from years of hard work, handled the spoon with unexpected grace. "The sheriff stopped by," she said, straightening the blanket. "He'd like to speak with you when you're feeling stronger." Tension tightened Elijah's shoulders. Did he say why? Just being cautious. It's his job to know who's in town. She studied his face. "Is there a reason that concerns you?" "No," the word came too quickly. "I'm not wanted, if that's what you're asking." "I wasn't." She paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since he arrived. "What are you running from, Mr. Young?" His spoon stilled. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Ghosts." The simple word carried such weight that Nora felt its heaviness in the air between them. She understood ghosts the way they followed, the way they whispered in quiet moments, the way they made the world feel hollow. "I know something about that," she said softly. His eyes met hers, searching. Whatever he saw there seemed to ease something in him. "Your husband?" "Yes. 3 years ago now, typhoid. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice touched her. "Thank you. I have my son, Benjamin. He's 8. "That helps." Elijah nodded, returning to his broth. After a few spoonfuls, he said, "This is good. It's not much, but it'll help you regain your strength." She moved toward the door. "If you need anything during the night, just call out. I'm a light sleeper." "Mrs. Vance," he said as she reached the doorway. "Thank you." Not everyone would take in a stranger like this. "In this part of the world, Mr. Young, we help each other. It's how we survive." She offered a small smile. "And please call me Nora." "Elijah," he returned, the ghost of a smile touching his lips before fading away. That night, Nora lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the man sleeping under her roof. There was danger in him, certainly not the kind that threatened her physically, but the kind that threatened her carefully constructed peace. She recognized in him the same restlessness that had nearly consumed her after James died, before Benjamin's needs anchored her to life again. She wondered what or who had been Elijah Young's anchor, and what had happened to set him adrift. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching summer day. Nora was already at work in her kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with dried apples and honey, when she heard movement from the spare room. She turned to find Elijah standing in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame. He'd pulled on his pants but left his chest bare except for her bandages. Despite his injury, his presence filled the small room, bringing with it an awareness that made her suddenly conscious of her loose mourning braid and simple house dress. "You shouldn't be up," she said, recovering her composure. "Never could stay in bed once the sun's up." His voice was rough with sleep. "Is there coffee on the stove? But you should be resting." He moved to the table, his movements careful but determined. "I rest better sitting up than lying down." Nora poured him coffee in a blue ceramic mug, noticing how the morning light accentuated the angles of his face. He was handsome in a weathered way, with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that rarely smiled. A shadow of stubble darkened his jaw and his dark hair fell in disarray across his forehead. "How's the wound?" she asked, setting breakfast before him. "Sore but no fever. You do good work." He took a sip of coffee. "You learned doctoring from your husband." "No, my father was a doctor back east. I grew up helping in his practice." She sat across from him with her own coffee. "James was a farmer. We came west for the land. Must have been hard losing him and managing on your own." "It was, still is sometimes." She stirred honey into her mush. "But we manage. I grow herbs for medicines, help the doctor when he needs it, sell preserves and baked goods." "Your son is with his grandparents." "Yes, my in-laws in Sacramento. They have him for the summer. It's good for him to spend time with them, and the city schools are better than what we have here." Elijah nodded, eating with the focused appreciation of a man who'd known hunger. "How long have you been in Wasco?" "5 years. We came in '73 when the railroad was just pushing through." She smiled faintly at the memory. "It was hardly more than a few buildings then. James had such dreams for our little farm. And now I keep it going the best I can. The vegetable garden does well enough and I have a few chickens and a milk cow." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? Where are you from originally?" He hesitated as if weighing how much to share. "Missouri, left after the war." "Were you a soldier?" "Too young. My older brother fought for the Union, came back different." His expression closed off slightly. "Moved west with him and his wife afterward, worked ranches mostly." Nora sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she asked, "And now you're heading where?" "North, maybe, Oregon. Heard there's good land there." "Looking to settle down?" Something dark flickered in his eyes. "No, just looking." Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. Nora rose to answer it, finding Dr. Samuel Jenkins on her porch, medical bag in hand. "Morning, Nora. Howard said you had a patient. Thought I'd stop by on my rounds." "That's kind of you, Samuel. Please come in." She led him to the kitchen where Elijah had straightened in his chair, his posture suddenly more guarded. "Dr. Jenkins, this is Elijah Young." Elijah, our town doctor. The doctor, a balding man in his 50s with spectacles and a neat gray beard, extended his hand. "Mr. Young." Elijah shook it briefly. "Doctor, mind if I take a look at that wound? Nora's skilled, but I like to check her work." His eyes twinkled with gentle teasing. "If Mrs. Vance doesn't mind." Nora gestured to the bedroom. "You can use the spare room. I'll clean up here." As the men moved to the other room, She heard the doctor's professional queries and Elijah's short responses. Their voices were too low to make out the words, but the tone suggested the examination was proceeding without issue. When they returned, Dr. Jenkins was nodding approvingly. "Clean work, Nora, as always. The wound looks good, no infection setting in, but," he turned to Elijah, "you need rest. That means staying put for at least a week." Elijah frowned. "A week? I was planning to leave tomorrow. And reopen that wound the first time your horse takes a misstep." The doctor shook his head. "Not advisable, young man. I've inconvenienced Mrs. Vance enough already." "Nonsense," Nora interjected. "The room would be empty anyway with Benjamin away. There's no inconvenience." Dr. Jenkins looked between them with a shrewd expression. "Well, that's settled then. Keep the bandage clean and dry, change it daily. No heavy lifting or riding." He packed up his bag. "I'll check back in a few days." After seeing the doctor out, Nora returned to find Elijah standing at the window, looking out at her garden with a troubled expression. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "But the doctor's right about the risks." He turned, his face unreadable. "Why are you doing this? Taking in a stranger, caring for him?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "I told you, out here we help each other." "That's not all of it." Nora considered him for a long moment. "No," she admitted. "It's not. When James was dying, people helped us. Neighbors brought food, watched Benjamin, sat with me through the worst nights. I learned then that kindness isn't just a nicety, it's how we survive our darkest hours." She met his gaze steadily. "Everyone deserves that kindness, Mr. Young, even strangers, even you." Something shifted in his eyes, a vulnerability quickly masked. "And if I'm not the kind of man who deserves kindness?" "I haven't met that man yet," she replied simply. "Now, if you're staying, we should see about getting you a clean shirt. I can mend yours, but you'll need something to wear in the meantime." The change of subject seemed to relieve him. "I have another in my saddlebags, if someone could fetch them from the livery. I'll send word with the boy who delivers my eggs. In the meantime, I have one of James's shirts that might fit you." The mention of wearing her dead husband's clothing made Elijah uncomfortable, but he nodded. "Thank you." Later that morning, after Nora had helped him into one of James's shirts, a simple blue cotton that was slightly too tight across Elijah's broader shoulders, the sheriff arrived. Nora showed him in, then excused herself to work in her garden, giving the men privacy. From where she knelt among the tomato plants, she could see them through the window, their conversation appearing civil though Elijah's posture remained tense. After about 20 minutes, the sheriff emerged onto the porch. Nora set down her trowel and went to meet him. "Everything all right?" she asked. Sheriff Mills nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He's no outlaw, at least not one I've heard about. Seems straight enough, though he's carrying something heavy." He studied her face. "Be careful, Nora, not all wounds are visible." "I know that better than most, Thomas." His eyes softened with understanding. "That you do. Just remember, you've got friends here if you need anything." After the sheriff left, Nora returned inside to find Elijah standing by the window, watching the lawman's departure. "He seems satisfied," she observed. "For now." Elijah turned to face her, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Vance, Nora, I appreciate your hospitality, but I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "Are you expecting trouble?" "I'm not running from the law, if that's what you're asking." "I believe you, but you're running from something." He held her gaze for a long moment, then looked away. "Some things you can't outrun, no matter how far you go." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Nora recognized the weight of them, the burden of carrying a past that wouldn't release its grip. "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes, just for a little while, you can stop running and catch your breath." His eyes returned to hers, searching. Whatever he saw there must have reassured him because some of the tension left his shoulders. "A week," he conceded. "Then I'll move on." Nora nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought. A week. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Elijah proved to be a surprisingly considerate houseguest, insisting on helping with what tasks he could manage despite his injury. He fixed a loose shutter, repaired the wobbly leg on her kitchen table, and even took to feeding the chickens each morning, claiming the short walk to the coop was good exercise for his healing side. Nora found herself enjoying his company more than she'd anticipated. He was quiet but thoughtful, with an unexpected depth of knowledge about everything from carpentry to astronomy. In the evenings, they would sit on her small porch, watching the stars emerge while sharing tea or, occasionally, a glass of the blackberry wine she made each summer. It was during one of these evening conversations, 4 days into his stay, that Elijah finally began to open up about his past. "My brother Daniel and I came west in '66, he said, his voice low and reflective. He'd fought at Shiloh at Gettysburg, came back with nightmares that never left him. His wife, Sarah, thought the fresh air and open spaces might help. Did it? Nora asked, cradling her teacup in both hands. For a time. We worked ranches in Colorado, then moved to Arizona Territory, eventually settled in Northern California. His eyes were distant, focused on memories rather than the darkening sky. Built a small spread near Redding, nothing fancy, but it was ours. Daniel seemed better there. The nightmares came less often. You were close, you and your brother. He practically raised me after our parents died. Typhoid like your husband, he glanced at her. I was 12. Daniel was 20, gave up his plans for college to keep our family together. He sounds like a good man, the best I've known. Elijah's voice roughened. They both were Daniel and Sarah. They never had children of their own, but they made me feel like their son rather than Daniel's burden of a brother. Nora heard the shift in his tone, the darkening of his memories. What happened to them? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she had to lean closer to hear, he said, I failed them. The raw pain in those 3 words made her heart ache. She waited, giving him space to continue or retreat as he needed. 2 years ago, he finally said, we had a good season. Better than good. Decided to drive our cattle to market ourselves instead of selling to the buyers who came through. Better prices that way. His hands tightened around his cup. I went into town the night before we were to leave to get supplies, stayed for a few drinks. He fell silent again, his jaw working as he struggled with the memory. You don't have to tell me, Nora said gently. No, he drew a deep breath. Maybe it's time someone knew. She reached across the space between their chairs and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of support without pressure. I met a man in the saloon, he continued. Professional gambler type, but friendly enough. We played cards, had a few drinks. He asked about the ranch, about our plans. I'd had enough whiskey to talk too much, told him about the cattle drive, the money we hoped to make. His voice hardened with self-recrimination. Stupidest thing I ever did. Nora could guess where the story was heading, but she remained silent, letting him tell it in his own way. I stayed in town that night. When I rode back the next morning, I saw the smoke from a mile away. His voice became distant, detached, as if the only way he could tell the story was to step outside it. They'd come in the night, 3 men, the gambler and 2 others. They wanted the money Daniel kept in the house, not much, but enough. When he resisted, they shot him. Sarah tried to run, they caught her. He stopped, unable to continue that part of the story. By the time I got there, the house was burning. I found Daniel on the porch. He was still alive, just barely. Told me what happened, told me to find Sarah. His voice cracked. She was in the barn. They'd left her there thinking she was dead, but she was still breathing when I found her. Nora felt tears welling in her eyes, both for the tragedy and for the obvious torment it still caused him. "She died in my arms," Elijah whispered. Her last words were asking about Daniel. I couldn't tell her he was already gone. "Oh, Elijah," Nora murmured, her heart breaking for him. "I buried them side by side under the oak tree where we used to have Sunday dinners in the summer." His face was etched with grief and guilt. "Then I went after the men who did it." The way he said it sent a chill down Nora's spine. "Did you find them?" "Eventually. Took 6 months." His voice had gone flat. The gambler was in Sacramento. One of his partners was working at a logging camp near Stockton. The third had made it all the way to Los Angeles. "And," she prompted when he fell silent. His eyes, when they met hers, were haunted. "I'm not proud of what I did, Nora. But they won't hurt anyone else." She understood what he wasn't saying. Under normal circumstances, the knowledge that he had killed 3 men might have frightened her. But there was no threat in his confession, only the burden of a man who had crossed a line he'd never thought to cross and couldn't forgive himself for it. "After that," he continued, "I couldn't go back to the ranch. Sold it to a neighbor for whatever he'd give me. Been drifting ever since." He looked down at his hands. "Some nights I still hear Sarah asking about Daniel. Some days I can still feel her blood on my hands." Nora sat with his story, honoring its weight. After a long moment, she said, "It wasn't your fault, Elijah. If I hadn't been loose-tongued in that saloon, then they might have found another target, another family. Evil finds its opportunities." She leaned forward. "You can't carry the blame for what those men chose to do. I should have been there. And then there might have been 3 graves under that oak tree instead of 2. Her voice was gentle but firm. "The only people responsible for Daniel and Sarah's deaths are the men who killed them." He shook his head, not ready to accept her absolution. "I can still hear them sometimes. At night, calling my name. I know." She reached for his hand, covering it with her own. "After James died, I used to wake up thinking I'd heard him calling from the other room. I'd get up, go to him, only to find empty space." "How did you bear it?" "1 day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time." She squeezed his hand. "And I had Benjamin. He needed me to keep going, so I did." "You're stronger than I am." "No, just differently broken." She offered a sad smile. "We all carry our burdens, Elijah. The weight doesn't get lighter, but we get better at bearing it." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fully claimed the sky, the first stars appearing above them like distant lanterns. Nora was acutely aware that she was still holding his hand, but she didn't pull away. There was comfort in the connection for both of them. Finally, Elijah spoke again. "Thank you for listening, for not judging." "Who am I to judge? We've all done things we regret, made choices we wish we could unmake." She looked up at the stars. "All we can do is try to live better today than yesterday." When she finally released his hand and they went inside, something had shifted between them. A trust had formed, fragile but real. As she bid him good night at his bedroom door, Nora felt both lighter and heavier, lighter for having shared some of his burden, heavier for knowing the depth of his pain. That night she dreamed of James, but for the first time in years it wasn't a dream of loss and longing. In the dream, he smiled at her, serene and loving, before turning away to walk toward a distant horizon. When she woke, tears on her cheeks, she understood that something was changing, not just for Elijah, but for her as well. The next day brought an unexpected challenge. Nora was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw a group of riders approaching 4 men, dusty from the trail, leading pack horses loaded with supplies. She recognized the leader immediately. Victor Blackwood, owner of the largest ranch in the area, and a man whose interest in her had become increasingly difficult to deflect over the past year. She smoothed her apron, wishing she'd had warning of their arrival. Behind her, she heard the door open and knew without looking that Elijah had come out, likely alerted by the sound of approaching horses. "Nora," Blackwood called, raising his hat in greeting as the riders drew near. A tall man in his 40s with silver threading his dark hair and cold eyes that never quite matched his smile, he carried himself with the confidence of wealth and power. "Looking lovely as ever, Mr. Blackwood," she replied with careful politeness. "What brings you this way?" "Supply run to town. Thought I'd stop and see how you're faring." His eyes shifted to Elijah, narrowing slightly. "Didn't realize you had company." Nora turned, gesturing to Elijah who stood on the porch, his posture alert despite his casual stance. "This is Elijah Young. He's staying with me while recovering from an injury. Elijah, this is Victor Blackwood. His ranch is east of town." Elijah nodded but didn't approach. "Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's assessment was swift and dismissive. "Young." He returned his attention to Nora. "I've been meaning to speak with you about that parcel of land adjoining yours to the south. I'm interested in purchasing it, but thought I'd discuss it with you first, being neighbors." "That's considerate of you," Nora said, though she knew his consideration had more to do with his persistent courting than neighborly etiquette. "But I'm afraid I don't have time to discuss business right now. I have bread in the oven that needs checking. Perhaps I could call again tomorrow. We could discuss it over dinner." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "My cook could prepare something special, have it brought over." Before Nora could formulate a polite refusal, Elijah spoke from the porch. "Mrs. Vance already has dinner plans tomorrow." Blackwood's expression hardened as he looked between them. "I see. Well, another time, perhaps." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day, Nora Young." As the riders moved on toward town, Nora turned to Elijah with a mixture of gratitude and amusement. "Thank you. Though I wasn't aware I had dinner plans tomorrow." The corner of his mouth lifted in a rare half-smile. "Seemed like you needed an escape. I can make myself scarce if you'd prefer to dine alone." She laughed softly. "No, I think I'd prefer the company. Though I should warn you, Victor Blackwood doesn't take rejection well. He's been pursuing you since about 6 months after James died. At first, I thought he was just being neighborly. Then I realized his interest was more personal." She sighed, returning to her laundry. "He's not a bad man, just used to getting what he wants, and he's decided he wants me as his wife." Elijah came down the steps to help her with the heavier wet sheets. "And you're not interested?" "No." She shook out a sheet, then handed him one end to help hang it. "He's offering security, I suppose. His ranch is the largest in the county, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain. "But there needs to be more than security," Elijah finished for her. She glanced at him, surprised by his understanding. "Yes. James and I had so little in terms of worldly goods when we married, but we had love. After experiencing that, I can't settle for less." They worked together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, hanging the remaining laundry. Nora was aware of Elijah watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression thoughtful. "You could have a good life with someone like Blackwood," he said finally. "A comfortable one." "I don't need comfort. I need—" She stopped, realizing how revealing her words might be. "I'm content as I am." Elijah stepped closer, taking the clothespin from her hand when she struggled with a pillowcase in the strengthening breeze. Their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected warmth through her. "Are you?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. "Content." The question caught her off guard with its directness. I have my son, my home, it's enough." "That's not what I asked." Nora looked away, uncomfortable with his perception. "It has to be enough." He didn't press further, but she felt his gaze on her as they finished the laundry. There was something unsettling about having her careful contentment questioned, about having the tidy narrative she'd constructed for her life gently dismantled by this man who saw too clearly. Later that afternoon, a package arrived from town, Elijah's saddlebags, delivered by the egg boy. As Nora prepared dinner, she could hear Elijah moving about in the spare room, presumably sorting through his possessions. When he emerged for the meal, he was wearing his own shirt, the one she'd washed and mended and had shaved, his jaw smooth and his hair combed back from his forehead. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it highlighted how handsome he was when not gripped by pain or exhaustion. "You look better," she observed, setting a pot of beef stew on the table. "Feel better too. Your doctoring worked miracles." He took his seat across from her. "Though I'm not sure if it was the medicine or the care that did more good." The compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, brought warmth to her cheeks. "Probably the rest. Most people don't allow themselves enough of it, including you." He served himself stew, then passed the ladle to her. "You work harder than anyone I've seen. Out of necessity. Have you ever thought of remarrying, finding someone to share the burden?" She nearly dropped the ladle at his bluntness. "That's a rather personal question. Sorry." He had the grace to look abashed. "Being on the trail so long, I've forgotten my manners. It's all right." She served herself, gathering her thoughts. "To answer your question, yes, I've thought of it, but finding the right person, that's not so simple. Not even Blackwood with all his land and cattle." There was a teasing note in his voice that she hadn't heard before. She smiled despite herself. "Especially not him." What would it take, then? For the right person, Nora considered the question seriously. Someone kind. Someone Benjamin could look up to. Someone who... She paused, suddenly aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. "Someone who sees me, not just what I could be to them." Elijah's eyes held hers across the table, their expression intense but unreadable. "That's not asking too much, isn't it? In a place like this," she gestured vaguely, encompassing the small house, the town beyond. "Most men here want a housekeeper, not a partner. Then most men here are fools." The conviction in his voice was startling. Nora felt something shift in the air between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. To dispel it, she changed the subject. "Tell me about your plans. After you leave here, where will you go?" If Elijah noticed her deflection, he didn't comment on it. "North, probably. I've heard good things about Oregon. Might try my hand at ranching again, someplace where the memories aren't so close. Alone. It's simpler that way. Simpler, perhaps, but lonely." She served him more stew. "Daniel and Sarah wouldn't want that for you, would they?" He stiffened slightly. "No, but they're not here to say so. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have presumed." "It's all right." He relaxed again. "You're probably right. They'd want me to make a life, not just exist in the shadow of theirs." His expression turned wistful. "Sarah used to say I'd make a good husband someday if I could just stop being so bullheaded." Nora laughed softly. Was she right about the bullheadedness? Absolutely. His smile, when it finally emerged fully, transformed his face, erasing years of hardship. "Daniel used to say trying to change my mind was like trying to move a mountain with a soup spoon." "I can believe that." Their conversation flowed more easily after that, moving to lighter topics: childhood memories, funny stories, the peculiarities of small-town life. By the time they finished their meal and moved to the porch for their customary evening sit, Nora felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer night. As the stars emerged overhead, she found herself studying Elijah's profile, wondering what might have happened if they'd met under different circumstances, if he weren't carrying such heavy ghosts, if she weren't so determined to protect her hard-won independence. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, catching her gaze. I was just thinking that it's been nice having someone to talk to in the evenings. The admission cost her something, made her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't in years. It has. He looked out at the darkening yard. I'd forgotten what it was like, having a place to belong, even temporarily. You could belong somewhere permanently if you wanted to. The words slipped out before she could consider their implication. His eyes returned to hers, searching. Could I? The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither of them was ready to address directly. Before Nora could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. A rider was approaching at speed, and even in the dimming light, Nora recognized Howard from the livery. Something in his urgency sent a chill of foreboding through her. Elijah stood as Howard reined in his horse sharply at the gate. Nora, you need to come quickly. It's Mrs. Wilkins, the baby's coming early, and it's not right. Doc Jenkins is tending another patient out at the Peterson place. Nora was already moving, years of helping with emergencies making her response automatic. I'll get my bag. Howard, hitch up my wagon, please. As she hurried inside to gather her supplies, Elijah followed. I'm coming with you. She glanced up from where she was collecting herbs and bandages. Your wound is healing well enough. You shouldn't go alone, especially if there's trouble. She didn't have time to argue. All right, but you stay outside unless I call for you. The Wilkins farm was a 20-minute drive in the wagon, made more uncomfortable by the darkness and rutted roads. Howard had ridden ahead to let them know help was coming, leaving Elijah to drive while Nora mentally prepared for what might await her. You've done this before, Elijah asked as they jolted along the road. Helped with births? Yes, many times. But early ones are always risky, especially out here without proper medical facilities. He nodded, his face grim in the moonlight. My mother was a midwife before she died. I remember how worried she'd get when called to difficult births. When they arrived at the Wilkins farm, they found a scene of quiet panic. Thomas Wilkins, a young farmer barely into his 20s, paced the porch anxiously while his mother tried to comfort him. Inside, they could hear the moans of Martha Wilkins in labor. Nora moved quickly, instructing Elijah to wait outside with Thomas while she went in. The next hours blurred into a focused struggle to help the young woman deliver her premature baby. The child, a boy, came into the world tiny and blue, barely breathing, while Mrs. Wilkins Sr. tended to her exhausted daughter-in-law. Nora worked desperately to save the infant, clearing its airways, wrapping it in warm blankets, stimulating its breathing with gentle rubbing. For a terrible moment, she thought they'd lost him. Then, miraculously, the baby drew a shuddering breath and let out a weak cry. Tears of relief stung Nora's eyes as she continued her ministrations, encouraging each fragile breath. By dawn, mother and child were stable, though the baby would need careful watching in the days to come. When Nora finally emerged onto the porch, she found Elijah sitting with Thomas, their heads bent in quiet conversation. Whatever Elijah was saying seemed to be calming the young man's fears. He looked up when she appeared, rising quickly to meet her. How are they? Alive? Both of them. She swayed slightly with exhaustion, and his hand came up to steady her elbow. The baby is very small, but he's a fighter. Thomas rushed past them into the house to see his wife and son, leaving Nora and Elijah alone on the porch in the pink light of dawn. You need rest, Elijah said, his voice gentle. Let me take you home. The drive back was silent, both of them too tired for conversation. When they reached Nora's house, Elijah helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for coming with me, she said. Thank you for letting me. His eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. What you did tonight was amazing, Nora. You saved that child's life. We don't know that yet. The next few days will tell. But his words warmed her nonetheless. As they walked toward the house, Elijah suddenly stopped, his hand going to his side. "Your wound?" Nora asked, concern replacing exhaustion. "It's fine. Just pulled it a bit helping with the wagon." But his grimace belied his words. Inside, she insisted on checking his injury, finding that one of the stitches had torn, allowing a small seepage of blood. "Sit," she ordered, too tired to be gentle. "I need to fix this." As she gathered fresh bandages and needle and thread, Elijah watched her with an expression she couldn't interpret. "You're swaying on your feet. This can wait until you've rested. And let infection set in. I don't think so." She returned to where he sat at the kitchen table, setting down her supplies. "Take off your shirt," he complied, wincing slightly as he pulled the fabric over his head. In the morning light, his torso was a map of scars and hard-earned muscle, telling the story of a life lived without comfort or ease. Nora cleaned the wound carefully, her exhaustion making her hands less steady than usual. When she prepared to place a new stitch, Elijah caught her wrist. "Rest first," he said firmly. "I'll still be here in a few hours." The simple statement, "I'll still be here," affected her more than it should have. She looked up from his hand on her wrist to find his eyes watching her with a warmth that made her breath catch. "Promise." The word escaped before she could stop it, his expression softened. "Promise," she nodded, too tired to fight. "A few hours then, wake me if you need anything." "I won't need anything." He released her wrist. "Go sleep, Nora." She made it to her bedroom barely conscious, falling onto her bed still fully dressed. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Elijah's eyes, and how they'd looked at her with something that might, in a different world, have been more than gratitude. When Nora woke, the sun was high in the sky. She'd slept far longer than she'd intended. Rising quickly, she washed her face and changed into a fresh dress before hurrying to the main room. She found Elijah at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee before him and a book in his hands, one of James's old volumes of poetry that had sat untouched on her shelf for years. He looked up when she entered, closing the book. "You're awake. I was beginning to think you'd sleep the day away." "Why didn't you wake me?" She moved to the stove, finding a pot of coffee still warm. "You needed the rest, and I was fine." He indicated his side. "Haven't burst any more stitches." She poured herself coffee, then joined him at the table. "I'll still need to check it and replace that stitch." "After you've had something to eat." He rose, moving to the pantry with more ease than he'd shown in days. "I made biscuits. They're not as good as yours, but they're edible." The domestic seen Elijah moving about her kitchen, having prepared food while she slept, was disarmingly intimate. It reminded her of mornings with James, of the simple comfort of shared space and caring. "You didn't have to do that," she said, watching as he set a plate of slightly misshapen but golden biscuits before her. "Wanted to." He returned to his seat. "Small repayment for everything you've done." She broke open a biscuit, steam rising from its center. "It's surprisingly good. Don't sound so shocked." His tone was light, teasing. "I'm not completely helpless. I never thought you were." She studied him over her coffee cup. "You look better today. Feel better too." Whatever you did, it worked. They ate in comfortable silence, the air between them changed somehow by the night's events. There was an ease to their interaction now, as if the barriers each had constructed had begun to crumble. After breakfast, Nora checked his wound, finding it healing well despite the torn stitch. She replaced it carefully, aware of his eyes on her face as she worked. "Almost good as new," she pronounced, tying off the thread. "Thanks to you." His hand caught hers before she could move away. "Nora." The sound of approaching horses interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Looking out the window, Nora saw Sheriff Mills riding up, accompanied by another man she didn't recognize. "Thomas," she said, opening the door as the men dismounted. "Is everything all right, Morning, Nora?" The sheriff removed his hat. "Sorry to disturb you. This is Marshal Hargrove from Sacramento. He's looking for a witness in a case he's investigating." The stranger, a tall man with a weathered face and hard eyes, stepped forward. "Madam, I'm looking for a man named Young, Elijah Young. Livery owner in town said he might be staying here." Nora felt a chill run through her. Behind her, she was aware of Elijah standing in the doorway, his presence solid and suddenly tense. "I'm Young," he said, moving to stand beside Nora. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" Hargrove studied him with narrow eyes. "You were in Bakersfield about a week back." "I was. Had some trouble there, I understand." Elijah's face remained impassive. "A disagreement over cards, nothing serious." "The man you had that disagreement with is dead." Hargrove's statement fell like a stone in still water. "Killed 3 days ago in a robbery gone wrong." Nora felt Elijah stiffen beside her. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't see what it has to do with me. I've been here recovering from this." He indicated his side. "So I've been told." The marshal's tone remained neutral. "I'm not suggesting you were involved, Mr. Young, but you might have information that could help us. The man who died had associates unsavory characters. We're trying to track them down. I only met him the one time across a card table." "Don't know anything about his associates." Hargrove nodded slowly. "Still, I'd appreciate if you'd come into town, make an official statement, help us clear this up." Nora glanced at Elijah, concerned about what this might mean for him, but his expression revealed nothing. "Of course," he agreed. "I'll ride in with you." "Elijah, your wound," Nora began, "is healing well thanks to your care," he finished for her. "I'll be fine for a short ride." Sheriff Mills, who had been quiet during the exchange, finally spoke. "I'll have him back before dark, Nora, just routine questioning." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Something about the marshal's presence, about the hard look in his eyes, unsettled her deeply. Elijah disappeared briefly into the spare room, returning with his gun belt, which he buckled on with practiced ease. The transformation was subtle but significant. This was not the wounded man who had sat at her table reading poetry, but the guarded cowboy who had first arrived at her door. "I'll be back for dinner," he told her, his voice low and reassuring. "Don't worry." But as she watched the 3 men ride away, Nora couldn't help the foreboding that settled over her. She had just found someone who made her feel alive again after years of merely existing. The thought that he might be taken from her, either by circumstance or choice, was more painful than she'd expected. The afternoon stretched endlessly. To distract herself, Nora threw herself into chores, kneading bread with more vigor than necessary, scrubbing the already clean floor, weeding her garden until her hands were raw by late afternoon. With still no sign of Elijah or the sheriff, her worry had become a physical ache. She was considering hitching up her wagon and driving into town herself when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded her as she hurried outside, only to falter when she saw Sheriff Mills riding alone. "Thomas," she called, her voice betraying her fear. "Where's Elijah?" The sheriff dismounted, his expression grave. "He's still in town, Nora. There's been a complication." "What kind of complication?" She clenched her hands in her apron to stop them from shaking. "Marshal Hargrove received a telegram during our meeting. There's a warrant out for Elijah in Arizona Territory." He hesitated. "For murder." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "That's not possible. He told me about—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain how much Elijah would want her to reveal. "About his brother and sister-in-law." Sheriff Mills nodded. He told us too, said he tracked down the men responsible and killed them. Then he was avenging his family. Surely that counts for something. It might with a jury, but the law sees it as vigilante justice. The sheriff's eyes were sympathetic. Hargrove's holding him overnight. Plans to take him back to Arizona in the morning to stand trial. No. The word escaped her with such force that the sheriff stepped back. That's not right, Thomas. Those men murdered his family. What was he supposed to do? Let the law handle it, Sheriff Mills replied, though his tone suggested he understood Elijah's actions better than his words implied. And if the law couldn't, or wouldn't? Nora's voice rose with emotion. You know as well as I do that justice out here isn't always swift or certain. I know, Nora, and for what it's worth, I believe Young did what many men would have done in his place. He sighed heavily. But it's not up to me. Marshal Hargrove has jurisdiction. Can I see him? The sheriff hesitated. I'm not sure that's wise. Please, Thomas, I need to talk to him. Something in her expression must have moved him, because after a moment, he nodded. I'll take you in, but I can only give you a few minutes. Hargrove's already bending the rules, letting me keep Young in our jail overnight instead of taking him straight to Sacramento. The ride to town was tense and silent. Nora's mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. By the time they reached the small jail at the edge of Wasco's Main Street, she had made her decision. Sheriff Mills led her inside, past his small office to the cells in the back. Only one was occupied. Elijah sat on the narrow cot, his back against the wall, his face expressionless. But when he saw Nora, something flickered in his eyes, surprise followed by what might have been regret. You have 5 minutes, the sheriff said, unlocking the cell door to let Nora in. I'll be in my office. When they were alone, Elijah stood, keeping his distance as if afraid to come too close. You shouldn't have come. How could I not? She moved toward him, stopping when only a foot of space separated them. Is it true, what the sheriff told me? He nodded once, his jaw tight. I didn't lie to you, Nora. I just didn't tell you all of it. I understand why you did it. And she did with a clarity that surprised even her. I might have done the same in your place. A humorless smile touched his lips. No, you wouldn't have. You're stronger than that. You'd have found a way to keep living, to honor their memory without staining your hands with blood. Don't. She reached for him, her hands finding his. Don't do that. Don't make me better than I am just to punish yourself more. His fingers tightened around hers. I'm sorry for bringing this to your door, for making you care about someone who's just going to disappoint you. You haven't disappointed me. She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. And you won't. The intensity in his eyes nearly undid her. Nora, I'm going to prison. If I'm lucky, if not. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. No, she gripped his hands harder. Listen to me. I have money, not much, but enough. James's life insurance. I've been saving it for Benjamin's education, but stop. Elijah pulled his hands free. I won't take your son's future, and I won't have you tainted by association with me. It's my choice. Her voice hardened with determination. I've spent 3 years doing what others expected of me, being the proper widow, the devoted mother. For once, I'm choosing for myself. He studied her face, his expression softening. And you'd choose a wanted man, someone with blood on his hands. I'd choose you. The simple truth of it took her breath away. I don't know when it happened or how, but something in me recognized something in you from the first moment. Like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing, his eyes searching hers as if looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding neither, he slowly raised his hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. You make me whole, he whispered, the words holding a weight of meaning that transcended their simplicity. For the first time since I lost them, I feel like a complete person again when I'm with you, and that terrifies me because I know I'll lose this too. You don't have to." She leaned into his touch. "Trust me, Elijah, please." Whatever he might have said was interrupted by the sound of the sheriff's return. Reluctantly, they stepped apart. "Time's up, I'm afraid," Sheriff Mills said, his expression apologetic. Nora nodded, turning back to Elijah. "I'll come back in the morning, before—" She couldn't finish the thought. Nora. Her name on his lips sounded like both a plea and a goodbye. "Thank you for everything." As the sheriff led her out, Nora felt a resolve hardening within her. She would not lose Elijah without a fight. Some things were worth risking everything for, and she was beginning to believe that what was growing between them might be one of those things. That night, after returning home, Nora made her preparations. First, a letter to Benjamin, to be delivered only if necessary, explaining her actions and her love for him. Then, the retrieval of James's life insurance money from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Finally, a small bag packed with essentials enough for a journey, not so much as to slow them down. Her plan was simple, perhaps foolishly so. But desperation breeds simplicity, and Nora was desperate enough to believe it might work. Before dawn, she hitched her wagon and drove into town, arriving just as the first light touched the eastern horizon. The streets were quiet, most of Wasco still asleep. Sheriff Mills was at his desk when she entered the jail, looking as if he hadn't slept. He straightened when he saw her, surprise evident in his tired eyes. "Nora, wasn't expecting you this early." "I couldn't sleep," she replied, setting a basket on his desk. "I brought breakfast for you and the prisoners." He eyed the basket with a mixture of suspicion and hunger. "That's kind of you, but please, Thomas." She met his gaze steadily. "Let me at least give him a decent meal before he goes." Something in her expression must have reached him because after a moment he nodded. "All right, but make it quick. Marshal Hargrove will be here soon." In the cell, Elijah was already awake, standing at the small barred window. He turned when she entered, his face registering surprise at her appearance. "I told you not to come," he said, though there was no rebuke in his tone. "And I told you I was making my own choices now." She set the basket down on the cot. "I brought breakfast." As he approached, she lowered her voice. "Listen carefully. I've left the wagon at the edge of town behind Peterson's store. 2 horses are hitched and ready. There's money in the saddlebags, enough to get us to Oregon." His eyes widened. "Nora, no, I won't let you throw your life away for me. I'm not throwing anything away, I'm choosing a new path." She held his gaze. "The key to the cell is in the bread." Elijah glanced at the basket, then back at her, conflict evident in his expression. "And what about Benjamin? Your home, everything you've built here, Benjamin will understand someday, and a home is more than walls and a roof." She reached for his hand. "It's where you feel whole." The sound of voices from the front office interrupted them, one of them unfamiliar and authoritative. Marshal Hargrove had arrived. "Now or never," Nora whispered. "I'll create a distraction, make for the back door, then circle around to the wagon." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and kissed him, a brief, fierce press of lips that conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud. Then she turned and walked back to the front office, her heart pounding but her step steady. What followed happened so quickly that later, Nora would struggle to recall the exact sequence of events. She remembered engaging Marshal Hargrove in conversation, asking detailed questions about the legal process awaiting Elijah. She remembered Sheriff Mills excusing himself briefly to check on the prisoner, and the look of shocked betrayal on his face when he returned to report the cell empty. She remembered the confusion and accusations, the marshal's anger, her own feigned surprise and dismay. And she remembered the moment when, amid the chaos, She slipped away, walking as calmly as she could manage toward the edge of town where her wagon and Elijah waited. He was there, already mounted on one of the horses, holding the reins of the second. His expression when he saw her was a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race. "You came," he said as she approached. "Did you doubt I would?" She took the reins from him, mounting the second horse with practiced ease. "Part of me hoped you wouldn't. That you'd come to your senses." His eyes searched hers. "It's not too late to go back, Nora, to say I forced you or tricked you." "Is that what you want, for me to go back?" "No." The word was immediate and heartfelt. "God help me, no, I want you with me. I just don't want you to regret this." "The only thing I'd regret is letting you go." She urged her horse forward. "Now let's ride. They'll be looking for us soon." They rode hard through the morning, taking seldom used trails that Nora knew from her years in the area. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Wasco, though Nora knew it wouldn't be enough if Marshal Hargrove organized a serious pursuit. They stopped briefly to rest the horses at a small creek, the animals drinking gratefully while Elijah and Nora shared the bread and cheese she'd packed. "We need to keep moving," Elijah said, scanning the horizon. "Head north and west. If we can make it to the Sierra foothills, we'll have more cover." Nora nodded, though weariness was beginning to set in. The emotional toll of the past day, combined with the physical exertion of hard riding, left her drained. Elijah noticed, his expression softening. "You're tired." "I'll manage. We'll stop earlier tonight, find somewhere safe to rest properly." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand. "Nora, I need to say something before we go any further." She met his gaze, suddenly afraid of what might come next. "What is it?" "You've given up everything for me. Your home, your reputation, maybe even your relationship with your son." His voice was rough with emotion. "I need you to know that I understand what that means. And I swear to you, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that sacrifice." Tears stung her eyes. "It's not a sacrifice if it brings you what you truly want. Even so." His hand tightened around hers. "I love you, Nora Vance. I didn't think I'd ever say those words to anyone again, but there they are, and they're true." The simple declaration, spoken in the wilderness with only the horses and the whispering creek as witnesses, filled Nora with a joy she had thought forever lost to her. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both strange and familiar on her tongue. "I think I started to the moment you said I made you whole." He smiled then, the first true, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, erasing years of pain and guilt, revealing the man he might have been without the weight of his past. "We should go," he said, though he made no move to release her hand. "While we still have daylight." They rode through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved away from the valley into more rugged terrain. By evening, they had reached a small, isolated cabin that Nora knew of from her herb-gathering excursions, a trapper's shelter, long abandoned but still sound enough to provide cover for the night. Inside was sparse but clean: a rough wooden table, a chair, a simple bed frame with no mattress. Elijah built a small fire in the stone hearth while Nora tended to the horses, settling them in a lean-to at the back of the cabin. When she returned, she found him standing at the cabin's single window, watching the last light fade from the sky. He turned at her entrance, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. "About where we go from here." Nora nodded, joining him by the window. "I've been thinking about that. Oregon makes sense. It's far enough away and big enough to get lost in." "And Benjamin?" The question caught at her heart. "Once we're settled, I'll write to James's parents, explain everything, ask them to bring him to us. And if they refuse, then—" She swallowed hard, Then I'll go to them, find a way to see him to explain. Elijah studied her face in the fading light. He's your son, Nora. I won't keep you from him. I know. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. But he's 9 now. In a few years, he'll be old enough to make his own decisions, to choose where he wants to be. And in the meantime, we build something, a home, a life. She looked up at him, something for him to come to when he's ready. Elijah's arm came around her, pulling her close. I can't promise it will be easy. I don't want easy, I want real. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I want you. They stood that way as darkness claimed the cabin, holding each other in the quiet aftermath of decisions that had changed both their lives irrevocably. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks. But tonight, in this abandoned shelter far from the life she had known, Nora felt more at peace than she had in years. Later, as they lay together on a bed made of their blankets spread over the rough wooden frame, Elijah's arms around her and his breath warm against her neck, Nora whispered, "No regrets." His arms tightened in response. "None," he agreed, his voice low and certain in the darkness. "Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," she echoed, the word a promise and a prayer in the quiet night. Morning came with a clarity that only the mountains can bring, air so crisp it seemed to sparkle. Light so clean it revealed every detail of the landscape with startling precision. Nora woke to find Elijah already up, rekindling the fire and heating water for coffee. He turned at her movement, his smile warming her more effectively than the small fire. "Good morning." "Morning." She sat up, pushing her hair back from her face. "How long have you been awake?" "Not long." "Thought I'd let you sleep." He poured steaming coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "You needed the rest." She accepted the cup gratefully, noting how different he looked today, more relaxed, less haunted. As if the decision to embrace this new life, dangerous as it was, had lifted some of the burden he'd carried for so long. "We should reach the Sierra foothills by nightfall if we ride hard," he said, sitting beside her on the makeshift bed. "I know of a place, an old mining camp that's been abandoned for years. We can rest there, figure out our next move." Nora nodded, sipping her coffee. "And after that, north. Follow the mountains until we cross into Oregon." He took her free hand in his. "From there?" "Well, I've heard the Willamette Valley is good land, fertile, room to build." The vision he painted was compelling, a small farm in a green valley, far from the ghosts that had haunted them both. A place to heal, to start again. "It sounds perfect," she said, squeezing his hand. "A dream worth chasing." They broke their fast with the last of the bread and cheese, then packed quickly and set out. The day was clear, the trail relatively easy to follow as they ascended into more wooded terrain. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the jerky Nora had packed. As they sat beneath the shade of a towering pine, Elijah suddenly stiffened, his hand going to his gun. "What is it?" Nora whispered, alarmed by his sudden alertness. "Riders, coming fast." He stood, pulling her to her feet. "Get to the horses, now." They mounted quickly, Elijah leading them off the trail into denser forest. But it was too late. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and suddenly 4 riders burst into view, Marshal Hargrove at their lead. "Young," he called, raising his rifle. "Stop right there." Elijah pulled his horse alongside Nora's, his expression grim. "Go, ride north, I'll hold them off." "No," she gripped his arm. "Together, remember." "Nora, please, I'm not leaving you." Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding. Neither would abandon the other, whatever the cost. With a nod, Elijah turned his horse to face the approaching lawman, Nora beside him. "That's far enough, Marshal," Elijah called, his voice steady despite the odds against them. Hargrove raised his hand, signaling his men to halt. They fanned out, rifles ready. "It's over, Young. Come peacefully, and maybe the judge will show leniency." "And Mrs. Vance?" Elijah asked, his main concern evident in his tone. The marshal's eyes moved to Nora. "The lady will face charges of her own. Aiding a fugitive is a serious offense." Nora felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She hadn't fully considered the legal consequences of her actions, focused as she'd been on Elijah's freedom. "She had nothing to do with this," Elijah said, his voice hardening. "I forced her to come, threatened her." "That's not true," Nora protested, but Elijah silenced her with a look. "Is that so?" Hargrove's expression was skeptical. "Sheriff Mills tells a different story." "Sheriff Mills wasn't there when I broke out," Elijah countered. "I took Mrs. Vance as a hostage to ensure my escape. She's innocent." The marshal studied them both, clearly unconvinced. "We can sort that out in court. Now both of you dismount, slowly." Elijah's hand moved imperceptibly toward his gun, and Nora's heart froze. He couldn't outdraw 4 armed men. It would be suicide. "Elijah, no," she whispered, desperate to prevent what seemed inevitable. Well, what have we here?" A new voice, deep, commanding, broke the tension. From the trees to their right emerged a figure on horseback that Nora recognized with a shock of disbelief. Victor Blackwood. "Blackwood." Marshal Hargrove turned, clearly surprised by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does." Blackwood moved his horse forward, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "Mrs. Vance is a neighbor and friend. Her welfare very much concerns me." Hope flickered briefly in Nora's chest, only to be extinguished by Blackwood's next words. "Besides," he continued, "I believe Mr. Young and I have unfinished business." "What business?" Elijah demanded, his posture tense. Blackwood smiled coldly. "You killed my brother 2 years ago in Northern California." The revelation hit Nora like a physical blow. She looked to Elijah, whose face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Your brother," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Damian Blackwood. Professional gambler, though he had other interests as well, not all of them legal." Victor's eyes were hard as flint. "He wrote to me about meeting a rancher, learning of a cattle drive. Easy money," he said. "He and his friends murdered my family," Elijah said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Killed my brother and his wife for a few $100s. And you tracked him down and shot him in cold blood." Blackwood's hand rested casually on his gun. "An eye for an eye, I suppose." Marshal Hargrove looked between them, comprehension dawning on his face. "This is about revenge, then?" "Justice," Blackwood corrected. "The same justice Young sought. The difference is I have the law on my side." The tension in the clearing was unbearable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Nora felt as if she were watching a nightmare unfold, powerless to stop it. "Marshal," she said, desperation giving her courage, "surely there's another way." "If Mr. Blackwood's brother was involved in murder, the law deals with facts, madam," Hargrove interrupted. "And the fact is, Young took justice into his own hands. That makes him a murderer, regardless of his reasons." "Then take me in," Elijah said, his voice suddenly calm. "But let Nora go. She has a son waiting for her." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Always the hero, aren't you, Young? Even now." He turned to the marshal. "I have a proposition. Let Mrs. Vance return to Wasco under my protection. I'll ensure she faces no charges. In exchange, I want Young." "For what purpose?" Hargrove asked, suspicious. "To stand trial properly. In Sacramento, where Damian was killed, I have influence there, can ensure the process is fair." Nora didn't believe him for a moment. The look in his eyes promised only vengeance, not justice. But before she could speak, Elijah cut in. "Agreed. If Mrs. Vance goes free, completely free, no charges, I'll come quietly." "Elijah, no." Nora reached for him, but he moved his horse just out of reach. "It's the only way, Nora," he said softly, his eyes conveying what he couldn't say aloud. "For Benjamin's sake, if nothing else." "I can't lose you," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Not now. You won't." He held her gaze, a promise in his eyes that transcended their impossible situation. "No matter what happens, you won't lose me." Marshal Hargrove considered the arrangement, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Mrs. Vance may return to Wasco, provided she agrees to testify about Young's actions if required." "She will," Blackwood said before Nora could respond. "Then it's settled," the marshal concluded. "Mrs. Vance, you're free to go. Young, dismount and surrender your weapon." Elijah's eyes never left Nora's face as he slowly complied, removing his gun belt and handing it to one of the deputies. The look he gave her was filled with so much love and regret that it nearly broke her heart. "Go home, Nora," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Go to Benjamin. Live your life." "This isn't over," she promised, her voice low and fierce. "Whatever happens, this isn't over." As the lawman secured Elijah and prepared to depart, Blackwood moved his horse alongside Nora's. "I'll escort you back to Wasco," he said, his tone making it clear this was not an offer but a command. "That won't be necessary," she replied coldly. "I insist." His smile didn't reach his eyes. After all, the wilderness can be dangerous for a woman alone. Nora had no choice but to acquiesce, though every fiber of her being rebelled at leaving Elijah in the hands of his enemies. As they rode away, Nora and Blackwood in one direction, the marshal and his prisoners in another, she looked back one last time. Elijah sat straight in the saddle despite his bound hands, his eyes finding hers across the distance. In that moment, she made a silent vow this was not the end of their story. Whatever it took, she would find him again. The journey back to Wasco was tense and largely silent. Blackwood made a few attempts at conversation, but Nora's one-word responses eventually discouraged him. By the time they reached the outskirts of town in the late afternoon, an uneasy truce had settled between them. "You should know," Blackwood said as they approached her house, "that I meant what I said about ensuring you face no charges, despite your misguided loyalty to Young. I bear you no ill will." "How generous," Nora replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. He studied her with a calculating expression. "You care for him. I understand that, but he killed my brother, Nora. Surely you can understand my position as well." "Your brother murdered innocent people," she countered, "including Elijah's family, so Young claims." Blackwood's tone suggested skepticism. "Damien was many things, but I find it hard to believe he would resort to cold-blooded murder. And I find it hard to believe Elijah would lie about watching his sister-in-law die in his arms." Blackwood's expression hardened momentarily before settling back into its customary mask of civility. "Perhaps we'll never know the whole truth, but justice will be served, one way or another." The implied threat chilled Nora. "What does that mean?" "It means Young will face a judge and jury for his crimes." He smiled thinly. "Nothing more, nothing less." But Nora didn't believe him. There was something in his eyes, a cold satisfaction that suggested his plans for Elijah went beyond legal justice. When they reached her home, Blackwood dismounted to help her from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "Think carefully about your next steps, Nora," he advised, his voice soft but edged with steel. "You have a reputation to consider, a son to raise. Don't throw everything away for a man who's already lost." She pulled away from his touch. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood. But my decisions are my own." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "For now, perhaps. Good day, Mrs. Vance." As he rode away, Nora stood watching until he was out of sight, her mind racing. Blackwood's warning had only strengthened her resolve. She would not abandon Elijah to whatever fate awaited him in Sacramento. Inside her house, everything was exactly as she had left it, yet it all felt different, smaller, emptier. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now seemed to belong to another life. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Sheriff Mills on her porch, his expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Nora," he said, removing his hat. "May I come in?" She stepped back, allowing him entry. "Have you come to arrest me, Thomas?" "No." He sighed, settling his hat on her table. "Marshal Hargrove has agreed not to press charges against you in exchange for your testimony if Young's case goes to trial. Blackwood's influence, no doubt. Perhaps." The sheriff studied her face. "What were you thinking, Nora?" "Helping a wanted man escape, risking everything." "I was thinking that I love him," she replied simply, "and that what happened to his family was an injustice that the law failed to address." Sheriff Mills looked away, uncomfortable with her directness. "Even if that's true, taking the law into your own hands is never the answer." "Is that what you'd say if it had been your wife, your child?" She held his gaze steadily. "Would you wait for the law then?" He had no answer for that. After a moment, he changed the subject. "The marshal's taking Young to Sacramento tomorrow. From there, he'll stand trial." "In a court where Blackwood has influence," Nora pointed out. "It won't be a fair trial, Thomas, you know that. There's nothing I can do about that." His expression was genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, Nora." "Truly?" After the sheriff left, Nora sat alone at her kitchen table, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had failed Elijah once. She would not do so again. But what could she do against the combined forces of the law and Victor Blackwood's wealth and influence? As night fell, she lit a lamp and began to write first a letter to her in-laws, explaining that she would be coming to Sacramento to retrieve Benjamin. Then a second letter to an old friend of James's who practiced law in the city. If Elijah was to have any chance at all, he would need legal representation that wasn't under Blackwood's thumb. By morning, she had a plan, not a good one, perhaps, but the only one she had. She would follow Elijah to Sacramento, find an ally in James's friend, and fight for him through legal channels. If that failed, well, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. She packed carefully this time clothes for city life, the remainder of her savings, James's pocket watch that could be sold if necessary. By mid-morning she was ready to depart. As she locked her front door, uncertainty gripped her briefly. She was risking everything on a slim chance. But then she remembered Elijah's words, "You make me whole," and her resolve hardened. Some chances were worth taking, some risks worth embracing. The journey to Sacramento was long and uncomfortable, the stagecoach crowded and the roads rough. By the time Nora arrived in the city 2 days later, she was exhausted and sore, but determined. Her first stop was the law offices of Edward Lawson, James's old friend. To her relief, he remembered her and agreed to see her immediately. "Mrs. Vance," he greeted her, rising from behind a desk piled high with papers. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to Sacramento?" "A legal matter, Edward. A very urgent one." She explained the situation as succinctly as possible, watching his expression shift from surprise to concern. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. "This is complicated, Nora. The Blackwood family has considerable influence in this city. Taking on a case against them would be challenging, to say the least." "I understand that. But Elijah deserves a fair trial at minimum. And the circumstances of his actions, the murder of his family, should be taken into account." Lawson nodded slowly. "Yes, that could constitute extenuating circumstances, but proving it would be difficult, especially after so much time has passed." "Will you help us?" Nora pressed. I can pay your fee, not much, but he waved away her mention of payment. This isn't about money, Nora. James was a good friend. I owe him and by extension you more than I could ever repay. He sighed heavily. I'll take the case. But you should know that the odds are not in our favor. Relief flooded her. Thank you, Edward. When can we see him? I'll make inquiries immediately. The prisoner should have arrived yesterday. Assuming he's being held at the county jail, I can arrange a visit for tomorrow morning. As Nora rose to leave, Lawson added, One more thing, Nora, be careful. If Victor Blackwood is as determined as you say, he won't appreciate your interference. Stay alert. That night, in a modest hotel room paid for with the last of her ready cash, Nora found sleep elusive. The city noises were unfamiliar after years in the quiet of Wasco, and her mind would not stop racing with possibilities and fears. Would Elijah be relieved to see her, or dismayed that she had followed him? Would Lawson be able to build a defense that might save him from the gallows? And what of Blackwood's veiled threats? Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Nora dressed carefully in her best dress, a dark blue that James had always said brought out her eyes, and met Lawson at his office as arranged. I've secured permission for us to visit the prisoner, he informed her. But we'll have limited time, and they'll be monitoring our conversation. The county jail was a grim stone building in the heart of the city. Inside, the air was damp and cold despite the summer heat outside. Nora steeled herself as a guard led them through iron-barred doors to a small room used for meetings between prisoners and their counsel. When Elijah was brought in, his hands shackled before him, Nora had to suppress a gasp. In just a few days he looked thinner, his face shadowed with stubble and darkened by a bruise along one cheekbone. But his eyes, when they found her, lit with a mixture of surprise and what might have been joy, quickly masked. Nora, he said, her name a whisper on his lips. What are you doing here? Did you think I would leave you to face this alone? She countered, moving toward him only to be stopped by the guard's warning hand. No touching, the man grunted. Rules. Lawson stepped forward, extending his hand to Elijah. Edward Lawson, Mr. Young. I'll be representing you in court. Elijah shook his hand, confusion evident on his face. I don't understand. I can't pay for a lawyer. Consider it taken care of, Lawson replied smoothly. Now we don't have much time. I need you to tell me everything about what happened with the Blackwood brother. Every detail you can remember. For the next half hour, Elijah recounted the events that had led to his confrontation with Damian Blackwood in Sacramento 2 years earlier. Lawson took notes, occasionally interrupting with questions, while Nora listened with growing horror at the full extent of what Elijah had endured. So you confronted him in his hotel room, Lawson summarized. There was a struggle, and in the course of it you shot him. Yes, Elijah confirmed. He drew first. I was faster. Self-defense then, that's important. Lawson made another note. Were there witnesses to either the struggle or the shooting? None that would speak up. The hotel was not the kind of place where people ask questions. Lawson nodded grimly. And the other 2 men? The ones who were with Blackwood at your ranch? Elijah's expression darkened. Found one working as a lumberjack near Stockton. The other had made it to Los Angeles. He paused. I didn't give them the chance to draw. I see. Lawson's face revealed nothing of his thoughts. That complicates matters, but there may still be a defense. If we can establish the brutal nature of your family's murders, a jury might be sympathetic. Can we win this? Nora asked, voicing the question foremost in her mind. Lawson hesitated. It's possible. But I won't lie to you, it's an uphill battle. The prosecution will argue premeditation, and with 2 of the 3 killings they have a strong case. Even though they murdered his family first. Nora couldn't keep the outrage from her voice. The law doesn't recognize personal vengeance as a defense, Nora, no matter how justified it might seem. Lawson gathered his notes. But there are other avenues, character witnesses, evidence of the original crimes. It's not hopeless. As the guards signaled that their time was almost up, Nora moved closer to Elijah, ignoring the watchful eye of the lawman. "I'm staying in Sacramento," she told him. "I'll be at every hearing every day of the trial." Elijah shook his head. "You should go back to Wasco, to Benjamin. Benjamin is safe with his grandparents, and I'll send for him soon." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not leaving you, Elijah, not this time." Something in his expression softened, the protective barrier he'd erected beginning to crumble. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. And don't you forget it." She managed a small smile. "We'll get through this, together." The guard stepped forward to lead Elijah away. As he turned to go, he looked back at Nora, his eyes conveying what he couldn't say aloud. "You make me whole," he mouthed silently, before the guard ushered him through the door. Outside the jail, Lawson outlined the next steps, filing motions, gathering evidence, preparing for the preliminary hearing scheduled for the following week. Nora listened carefully, committing everything to memory. "One more thing," Lawson said as they parted. "I've taken the liberty of arranging accommodations for you with my sister. She has a boarding house on Pine Street, much more suitable than a hotel for an extended stay. And safer given the circumstances." "Thank you, Edward." Nora was touched by his thoughtfulness. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," he replied grimly. "The real battle is just beginning." The days that followed settled into a rhythm of preparation and waiting. Nora wrote to her in-laws, explaining the situation and asking to visit Benjamin. Their reply was cool but not unkind. She was welcome to see her son, but they expressed concern about her association with a man accused of murder. The preliminary hearing came and went, with Elijah being formally charged and a trial date set for 3 weeks hence. Lawson worked tirelessly, tracking down witnesses who could testify to Daniel and Sarah Young's characters, seeking evidence of Damian Blackwood's criminal activities, building a case for self-defense and extreme emotional distress. Throughout it all, Nora was a constant presence in the courtroom during hearings, in Lawson's office helping to organize documents, in the jail during the brief visits she was allowed with Elijah. She drew strength from his quiet resilience, even as she worried about the toll of confinement on his spirit. 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, an unexpected development occurred. Nora was returning to the boarding house from an errand when she noticed a familiar figure waiting on the porch. Sheriff Thomas Mills from Wasco. "Thomas," she called, surprised. "What are you doing in Sacramento?" He turned at her voice, removing his hat. "Nora, I've been looking for you." "Is something wrong? Is it Benjamin?" "No, nothing like that." He glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Inside the boarding house parlor, with the door closed against curious ears, Sheriff Mills revealed the purpose of his visit. "I've been doing some thinking since you left," he began, turning his hat in his hands. "About Young's story, about the Blackwoods." Nora's heart quickened, and I remembered something. 2 years back, around the time Young says his family was killed, we had a trio of men come through Wasco. Bad sorts. One of them matched the description Young gave of Damian Blackwood. Did they cause trouble in town? Not in Wasco itself. But a week after they passed through, we got word of a homestead burned out near Reading. Family killed man and woman. It was similar to what Young described. Hope flared in Nora's chest. "Thomas, this could help Elijah's case. Would you be willing to testify?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's why I'm here. It's not much. I never made the connection until now, But if it helps ensure Young gets a fair trial, then yes, I'll testify. Thank you. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gratefully. This means more than you know. Mills looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. There's something else. Something you should know about Victor Blackwood. What about him? After you left, I did some digging. Asked around about the Blackwood brothers. Turns out they have a reputation even back east. Old money, but not all of it clean. There were rumors about Damien gambling scams, protection rackets, and Victor. He hesitated. Victor's been known to make problems disappear. A chill ran down Nora's spine. What are you saying? I'm saying be careful. The trial's not the only threat Young faces. After Sheriff Mills left, promising to return for the trial, Nora immediately sought out Lawson to share the new information. The lawyer was cautiously optimistic. It's circumstantial, he admitted, but it helps corroborate Young's account. Combined with what I've learned about Damien Blackwood's activities in Sacramento, it starts to build a picture that might sway a jury. And what about Thomas's warning? About Victor Blackwood? Lawson's expression grew serious. I've heard similar rumors. We'll need to be vigilant. I'll speak to the jail officials, see if Young can be moved to a more secure cell. But despite these precautions, Nora couldn't shake her sense of foreboding. It intensified when, 3 days before the trial was to begin, she spotted Victor Blackwood himself on the street outside the courthouse, deep in conversation with a man she recognized as the district attorney. When Lawson informed her that evening that the prosecution had suddenly acquired new witnesses, men who would testify that Elijah had hunted down his victims with cold-blooded premeditation, her fears seemed confirmed. He's manipulating the system, she said, pacing Lawson's office. Using his influence to ensure Elijah is convicted. It appears that way, Lawson agreed grimly, but we're not without resources of our own. Sheriff Mills's testimony will help, and I've managed to locate a former associate of Damien Blackwood who's willing to testify about his criminal activities. Will it be enough? I don't know, Nora. I truly don't. Lawson looked exhausted, the strain of fighting against such powerful opposition evident in the lines of his face. But we'll give it everything we have. The night before the trial, Nora was granted a special visit with Elijah, a courtesy arranged by Lawson through his connections with the court. They were allowed to meet in a small room adjacent to the cells, with more privacy than their previous visits had afforded. Elijah looked better than he had during their first meeting at the jail. His bruises had faded, and he'd been allowed to shave and wear clean clothes in preparation for his court appearance. But there was a resignation in his eyes that worried Nora. Lawson says the case is stronger than he initially thought, she told him, taking his hands across the table between them. Sheriff Mills has come to testify about the men who passed through Wasco, and they've found someone who knew Damien Blackwood, who can speak to his character. Elijah nodded, but without much enthusiasm. That's good. Why don't you seem more encouraged? He met her eyes directly. Because I know Victor Blackwood's type, Nora. Men like him don't lose, not when they set their minds to something. You can't think like that. We have the truth on our side. The truth, he smiled sadly. How often does that actually matter? It matters to me. She tightened her grip on his hands, and it will matter to the jury when they hear what really happened. He studied her face, his expression softening. You still believe in justice, even after everything. I believe in fighting for what's right, for who's right. She leaned forward. And I believe in you, Elijah. I believe in us. Something in his eyes changed then, a spark reigniting where resignation had been. Tell me again. That I believe in you. No. What you said that day when we were riding away, when I asked if you had regrets. No regrets, she said softly, understanding what he needed to hear. None. Whatever happens, I choose this. I choose you." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then I'll fight for both of us." The trial began the next morning in a crowded courtroom. Nora sat directly behind the defense table, her posture rigid with tension as Elijah was led in, his hands shackled until the bailiff removed the restraints for the proceedings. The district attorney's opening statement painted Elijah as a cold-blooded killer who had tracked down and executed 3 men without regard for law or justice. He acknowledged the deaths of Daniel and Sarah Young, but characterized them as a tragic outcome of a legitimate business dispute gone wrong, rather than the brutal murders Elijah had described. Lawson's opening, by contrast, told the story of a man who had lost everything his only family slaughtered, their killers escaping justice, and who had been driven by grief and a profound sense of injustice to seek the vengeance the law had failed to provide. "The question before you today," Lawson told the jury, "is not whether Elijah Young killed these men. He freely admits that he did. The question is whether any of us, placed in his impossible position, might have done the same." As the prosecution presented its case, Nora watched the jurors' faces, trying to gauge their reactions. They were a mixed group: farmers, merchants, a few professionals. Most were men, though 2 older women had also been selected. Their expressions gave little away as witnesses testified to finding the bodies of the men Elijah had killed. As a hotel clerk described Elijah asking for Damian Blackwood's room number, as the alleged associates of the deceased men characterized them as honest businessmen. Victor Blackwood himself testified on the second day, cutting an impressive figure in an expensive suit as he spoke of his brother's good character and business acumen. His voice broke convincingly as he described learning of Damian's death, though his eyes remained dry and cold. When Lawson cross-examined him, focusing on Damian's gambling activities and questionable associates, Blackwood deflected skillfully, admitting his brother had his flaws but insisting he was no murderer. "Mr. Blackwood," Lawson pressed, "are you aware that around the time of the Young murders, your brother was seen in the company of 2 men who matched the description of the other assailants?" "My brother knew many people in his travels," Blackwood replied smoothly. "I couldn't possibly account for all of his associations." "And are you aware that these same 3 men were spotted passing through the town of Wasco just days before the Young homestead was burned?" Blackwood's composure slipped slightly. "I am not. And I fail to see how unsubstantiated rumors about my brother's whereabouts 2 years ago are relevant to his murder." "They establish motive, Mr. Blackwood. They connect your brother to the crime that led to his death." "Objection," the district attorney called. "Counsel is making unfounded accusations against a victim who cannot defend himself." "Sustained," the judge ruled. "Mr. Lawson, confine your questions to facts and evidence." As the defense began its case on the third day, Nora felt a growing sense of dread. Despite Lawson's skillful questioning and the testimony of Sheriff Mills and others, the prosecution's narrative seemed to be prevailing that Elijah had acted not in the heat of passion or self-defense, but with calculated, cold-blooded intent. When Elijah himself took the stand, Nora held her breath, knowing that everything now depended on his ability to convey the truth of what had happened and why. Under Lawson's gentle questioning, Elijah described the day he had returned to find his home in flames, his brother dying on the porch, his sister-in-law brutalized and clinging to life in the barn. His voice remained steady, but the pain in his eyes was so raw, so real that several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I held her as she died," he said, his gaze fixed on some middle distance. "She asked about Daniel, wanted to know if he was all right. I couldn't tell her he was already gone. "And what did you do after you buried them?" Lawson asked. "I tracked the men who did it. Took 6 months to find them all. Damian Blackwood was the last." Elijah's eyes moved to Victor Blackwood, seated in the front row of spectators. When I confronted him, he didn't deny what they'd done. He laughed, said they'd made a game of it, seeing who could make Sarah scream the loudest. A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "And then," Lawson prompted. "He went for his gun. I was faster." Elijah's voice was flat, emotionless. "I didn't feel anything when he died. Not satisfaction, not relief, nothing. It didn't bring them back." The district attorney's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on the premeditated nature of Elijah's pursuit of the 3 men, the time and planning it had taken, the multiple opportunities he'd had to turn to the law instead of taking justice into his own hands. Through it all, Elijah remained composed, answering truthfully even when the truth damaged his case. Yes, he had tracked the men with the intention of killing them. No, he hadn't gone to the authorities first. Yes, he knew what he was doing was against the law. When asked why, his answer was simple: because they deserved to die for what they did, and because no one else was going to make that happen. As the trial moved into its final day, with closing arguments scheduled for the afternoon, Nora found herself sitting beside Sheriff Mills in the crowded gallery, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "It doesn't look good, does it?" she whispered as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The sheriff shook his head slightly. "The prosecution has a strong case on the legal merits, but juries can be unpredictable. Sometimes they follow their hearts more than the letter of the law." Before she could respond, a commotion at the back of the courtroom drew their attention. A man was pushing his way forward, disheveled, unshaven, with the look of someone who had traveled hard and fast. "Your Honor," he called, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I have evidence relevant to this case." The judge banged his gavel. "Order, who is this man?" Lawson was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, if I may, I believe this is William Garrett, a witness we've been attempting to locate." The newcomer nodded vigorously. "That's right. I worked with Damian Blackwood in '76. I know what he did to the young family." The courtroom erupted in whispers and exclamations. The district attorney was objecting strenuously, arguing that introducing a new witness at this stage was irregular and prejudicial. After conferring with both attorneys at the bench, the judge allowed Garrett to be sworn in and questioned over the prosecution's continued objections. His testimony was devastating. He had been one of Damian Blackwood's associates, though not involved in the Young murders. But he had heard Blackwood and the others planning the robbery, had warned them against it, and had subsequently been threatened into silence when he learned what had actually happened at the ranch. Damian was always looking for easy targets, Garrett testified. When he heard about the cattle drive, about the money that would be at that ranch, he couldn't resist. "But I knew him. He never left witnesses. Never." "And why have you come forward now?" Lawson asked. Garrett glanced at Victor Blackwood, who was glaring at him with undisguised hatred. "Because I heard about this trial, that another man might hang for what Damian and his friends did." He swallowed hard. "I've been running from this for 2 years, figured it was time to stop." The district attorney's cross-examination was vicious, attacking Garrett's credibility, his criminal past, his motivations for coming forward. But the damage was done. The jury had heard corroboration of Elijah's account, from an unexpected source, one who had nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by testifying. In his closing argument, the district attorney reminded the jury of the law that vigilante justice was still murder. that even the most understandable motives didn't excuse taking the law into one's own hands. Lawson, in his closing, spoke not of legal technicalities, but of human justice of a system that sometimes failed those it was meant to protect, of the impossible choice faced by a man who had lost everything to violence and had seen no other path to justice. Elijah Young is not a cold-blooded killer, he concluded, his voice ringing through the hushed courtroom. He is a man who loved his family so deeply that when they were taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable, he did what he believed was necessary to ensure their killers faced consequences. Was it lawful? No. Was it understandable? I leave that to your conscience to decide. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Elijah was led back to his cell. Nora, allowed a brief moment with him before he was taken away, pressed his hand between both of hers. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "remember that you're not alone anymore." His eyes, when they met hers, held both love and a resignation that broke her heart. "If this goes badly, Nora, I want you to forget about me. Go back to Wasco. Build a life with Benjamin." "Don't," she said fiercely. "Don't say goodbye. This isn't over." But as hours passed with no word from the jury, her conviction began to waver. She waited in Lawson's office, pacing until the lawyer gently suggested she return to the boarding house to rest. "I'll send word the moment there's news," he promised. Back at the boarding house, Nora found it impossible to rest. She sat by the window of her small room, watching the street below as evening shadows lengthened, thinking of all that had led to this moment of James's death, of her carefully constructed life in Wasco, of the wounded cowboy who had appeared at her door and changed everything. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Expecting the boarding house matron, she was shocked to find Victor Blackwood standing in the hallway. "Mr. Blackwood." She moved to close the door, but his hand shot out, preventing it. "A moment of your time, Mrs. Vance." His smile was cold. "I believe we have matters to discuss." "We have nothing to discuss." She tried again to close the door, but he easily pushed it open, forcing her to step back as he entered the room. "I think we do." He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch ominous in the quiet room. "Specifically, your future, and Young's." Nora retreated to the window, putting the small writing desk between them. "The jury hasn't returned a verdict yet, but they will. And regardless of what they decide, I want you to know that I intend to see justice done for my brother." His voice was soft, almost conversational, but his eyes were hard. One way or another, understanding dawned on her. "You're threatening him, even if he's acquitted." Blackwood shrugged elegantly. "Let's call it insurance. The law sometimes fails, as your lawyer so eloquently pointed out." "And what do you want from me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Your silence, your return to Wasco, your agreement to put this unfortunate episode behind you." He moved closer, his confidence unsettling. "In exchange, I might be persuaded to be merciful in how I handle Young's case. You're asking me to abandon him. I'm offering you a chance to save his life." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Think about it, Nora. What future do you imagine with him? A man who's killed 3 people, who'll always be looking over his shoulder. Is that the life you want for yourself? For your son?" The question struck at her deepest fears, but she refused to show it. "Get out. Don't be hasty." He took another step toward her. "This is a generous offer considering the circumstances." "I said get out." She reached behind her, fingers closing around a heavy paperweight on the desk. "Or I'll scream, and you can explain to the landlady why you're in my room uninvited." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, but after a moment he stepped back. "Very well, but consider my offer carefully, Mrs. Vance. I won't make it again." After he left, Nora sank into a chair, trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Blackwood's threat had been clear. Even if the jury found Elijah not guilty, he would never truly be free as long as Victor Blackwood drew breath. She was still sitting there, turning the problem over in her mind, when another knock came at her door. This time it was Lawson's clerk, breathless and excited. "The jury's back," he announced. "They've reached a verdict." The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense with anticipation as Elijah was brought in. Nora found her place in the front row behind the defense table, her eyes never leaving him as he stood, straight and dignified, to hear his fate. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The judge asked. The foreman, a gray-haired merchant with kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the first count of murder in the death of Damian Blackwood, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Elijah Young, not guilty by reason of self-defense." A ripple of reaction ran through the courtroom. Nora's heart leaped with hope. "On the second count of murder in the death of John Harris, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty, but recommend mercy in sentencing due to the exceptional circumstances." "And on the third count of murder in the death of Michael Tanner, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty, with the same recommendation for mercy in sentencing." Nora felt as if she were falling. The mixed verdict, neither the complete exoneration they had hoped for nor the full conviction they had feared. Elijah stood impassive, showing no reaction as the judge thanked the jury and announced that sentencing would occur the following morning. "What does it mean?" she asked Lawson as the court began to clear. "It means the jury believed Elijah acted in self-defense with Blackwood, but not with the other two." Lawson looked tired but not defeated. "The recommendation for mercy is significant. The judge could sentence him to as little as 5 years, given the circumstances." 5 years. The words felt hollow in her mouth. Not a hanging, but still a separation that seemed unbearable. "It's better than we might have expected," Lawson reminded her gently. "And with good behavior, he could be released earlier." As Elijah was led away, his eyes found hers across the courtroom. In that brief moment of connection, she tried to convey everything she felt: love, hope, determination. He nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been missed by anyone not watching for it, before disappearing through the door to the cells. That evening, Nora received permission for one final visit before sentencing. In the small meeting room at the jail, she told Elijah about Blackwood's threat. "He won't stop," she concluded. "Even after you've served your sentence, he'll come after you. I know." Elijah's voice was calm, resigned. "Men like him don't forget or forgive." "Then we'll go somewhere he can't find us. After you're released, start over." He smiled sadly, reaching across the table to touch her face. "Always planning, aren't you? Even now?" "Always," she agreed, leaning into his touch. "Because I believe in our future, Elijah. 5 years isn't forever." "No." His smile softened, becoming more genuine. "It isn't. And knowing you're waiting, that will make it bearable." They talked for what remained of their allotted time, making plans that might never come to fruition, finding comfort in the simple act of imagining a future together. When it was time for her to leave, Elijah stood, drawing her into an embrace that the guard, in a rare moment of compassion, pretended not to notice. "No regrets," he whispered against her hair. "None," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Not one." The next morning, Nora dressed carefully for the sentencing hearing, choosing the blue dress that had become something of a talisman. As she prepared to leave the boarding house, a message arrived, not from Lawson, as she expected, but from Sheriff Mills, asking her to meet him urgently at a coffee house 2 blocks from the courthouse. Puzzled but trusting, she made her way there, finding the sheriff seated in a back corner, his expression grave. "Thomas, what's wrong?" He gestured for her to sit. "Blackwood's men were at the jail last night, tried to bribe one of the guards to get access to Young's cell." Cold fear gripped her. Did they know? The guard reported it instead of taking the bribe, but it confirms what we suspected. Mills leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Blackwood doesn't intend to let Young live to serve his sentence. What can we do?" Nora's mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Mills glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "There might be a way, but it's risky. And it would mean you couldn't return to Wasco, at least not for a long time. Tell me." The plan he outlined was audacious, dangerous, and possibly their only hope. As Nora listened, a sense of calm determination replaced her fear. This was their chance, perhaps their only chance for a future together. "It could work," she said when he finished, "but we'll need help." "Already arranged. Lawson knows people who can assist with the necessary papers, and I have friends who can ensure Young reaches the location safely." "When?" "Tonight, during the transfer to the state prison. It's the only opportunity we'll have." Nora nodded, her decision made. "I'll be ready." The sentencing hearing proceeded as expected. The judge, acknowledging the jury's recommendation for mercy, sentenced Elijah to 5 years in the state penitentiary, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. As he was led from the courtroom, Elijah's eyes found Nora's one last time, a silent goodbye that only she understood was not the end. That night, as a storm rolled in from the west, bringing lightning and driving rain, a prison transport wagon departed Sacramento carrying one prisoner bound for the state penitentiary. 2 hours into the journey, on a deserted stretch of road, the wagon was stopped by what appeared to be a fallen tree. As the guards investigated, shadowy figures emerged from the darkness. There was a brief struggle, no shots fired before the guards found themselves bound but unharmed, and their prisoner gone. By dawn, Elijah Young had vanished, a ghost in the vast expanse of the Sierra foothills. With him, equally vanished, was Nora Vance, last seen boarding an evening train bound for Oregon. A small carpetbag, her only luggage. Sheriff Thomas Mills, questioned extensively about the escape, maintained that he had no knowledge of the plan and had returned to Wasco the previous afternoon. If he noticed that his deputy had taken an unusually circuitous route back to town, passing near the site of the ambush around the time it occurred, he made no mention of it in his report. Victor Blackwood, upon learning of the escape, flew into a rage that confirmed to those who witnessed it that his interest in Young's case had never been about justice for his brother. He offered a substantial reward for information leading to Young's capture, but despite several false leads and reported sightings, no trace of the escaped prisoner or his accomplice was ever found. 3 months after the escape, Benjamin Vance joined his grandparents for their annual summer trip to visit relatives in Portland. He returned to their home in Sacramento 2 weeks later without comment, though observant neighbors noted the boy seemed happier than he had in years. 5 years later, a small farm in the Willamette Valley of Oregon was purchased by a couple named Edward and Nancy Walker. He was a carpenter and part-time rancher, she a skilled herbalist whose remedies were sought by neighbors for miles around. Their son, Benjamin, was a bright young man preparing for college, proud of his stepfather who had taught him to ride and hunt, and of his mother whose wisdom and strength were respected throughout the community. If anyone noticed that Edward Walker bore a slight resemblance to a fugitive from California justice, or that Nancy's eyes were remarkably similar to those of a widow who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years earlier, they kept such observations to themselves. The Walkers were good neighbors, hard workers, and devoted to each other with a depth of feeling that many found both touching and enviable. On summer evenings, the couple could often be seen sitting on their porch, watching the sunset with their hands clasped between them. Sometimes, visitors reported hearing fragments of conversation mentions of no regrets and words about being whole that seemed to hold special meaning for them. And if, occasionally, Edward Walker still woke in the night, haunted by memories of fire and loss, Nancy was always there, her presence a balm to old wounds that had finally begun to heal. They had built a life together, not the one either had imagined in their youth, but one that contained more joy than either had thought possible after the losses they had endured. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still moments of fear when strangers appeared on the road, still nights when the past seemed too close for comfort. But it was their life, chosen with open eyes and full hearts, and neither would have traded it for any other. On the 10th anniversary of their arrival in Oregon, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the summer sky, Elijah turned to Nora, his face softened by the years but his eyes still holding that intensity that had captured her heart from the beginning. "Any regrets?" he asked, the familiar question now a ritual between them. "Not one," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You still make me whole, Elijah Young, always have, always will." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to a love that had defied law and convention, loss and separation, to forge something unbreakable, a bond between two souls who had found in each other the healing they had thought forever beyond their reach.